Testing, testing, testing.
Testing, 1, 2, 3, testing.
Testing, testing, testing. Okay.
Testing, 1, 2, 3, testing. 1, 2, 3.
Testing, testing, testing.
This is the last one. Can you hear me? Yes. All right.
We'll do that. Well, good morning, everyone. And we're going to go ahead and call this hearing to order, and look forward to hearing the testimony today from the Acting Commissioner, Mr. Kautter. So thanks for joining us, and we appreciate your service and willingness to be a part of this subcommittee this morning to discuss the IRS's budget for 2019. And I realize you're testifying before us in this committee for the first time, but this is also a very busy time of year for you, so thanks for your time to be with us. Late last year, Congress passed and President Trump signed into law the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And as a result of this historic tax reform legislation, American families are taking home more of their hard-earned money. Businesses are expanding and confidence in our economy is growing, which means more jobs and opportunities for the American people. As Mr. Kautter is well aware, implementation of this law falls primarily on the IRS, which is why we provided $320 million for its implementation in last month's government funding bill. Specifically, this funding will go toward updating 100 different IRS IT systems to accommodate more than 100 new tax code provisions before the next filing season. This subcommittee is also committed to providing $77 million additional dollars in 2019 to finish the law's implementation. So I look forward to hearing how this implementation is progressing and how we can maintain that momentum as we move ahead through this year. But continuing on to the 2019 budget request that's before us, it also includes more than $500 million for operations support. And I know the Inspector General and the Government Accountability Office repeatedly commented on the IRS's mismanagement of IT projects in the past, from insufficient IT work plans to legacy systems that run on software language from the 1950s. This mismanagement puts our tax collection operations at risk. This committee expects better, as I know you do as well, Mr. Acting Commissioner. So I look forward to discussing how these funds will contribute to the replacement of legacy systems in the days ahead and the positive impact it will have on the overall taxpayer's experience. Additionally, the IRS is a prime target for cyber and identity theft. Because of the massive amount of personal information it receives and stores, we learned just a little while ago that over 2 million attempts any given day are against the IRS and that information. In the recent years, the IRS faced problems from data breaches in some of its e-services, services such as the Get transcript, identification protection, PIN apps, and the free application for federal student aid form, which is, we know as parents with kids going to college, as FAFSA. These breaches allowed cyber criminals to access taxpayer information and file fraudulent tax returns. The IRS must improve its cyber defenses and do more to protect the taxpayers' data. Similarly, improving the taxpayer expense is a major focus of this subcommittee and has been for the years that we've all served on it. In the past 2 annual appropriations bills, we've provided the IRS with targeted funds to improve that customer service experience. With the 2018 filing season drawing to a close, I'm very interested in learning what kinds of improvements our constituents are experiencing and what they can look forward to this year. But to that end, my top priority with this committee and in writing the appropriations bills we look ahead is ensuring that the taxpayer is truly respected. The IRS is on the front lines, but doesn't have the best track record in the past. So I look forward to hearing how our targeted investments are making life easier for the taxpayers and holding the IRS accountable for bad behavior. So before wrapping up my comments, I want to zoom out our focus just for a moment. And as we begin to look at the 2019 bills, and as a subcommittee, not forget the success we had last year. We had tremendous success, not only as a subcommittee, but as a full committee, defying all the odds as we passed all 12 appropriation bills for the first time in over a decade in regular order with a lot of amendments, a lot of debate, and a lot of discussion. So I hope that we have that same commitment this year, all of us together, to work together to do the same as we have begun our hearing process and hopefully have all our hearings done as a subcommittee by the end of the month, and maybe full committee next month, and have them all out of the House in June. Wouldn't that be great if we could do that? Or early July, I'd be okay with that. That said, Mr. Kautter, thank you again for taking time to meet with us today. I look forward to working with you and hearing your testimony. Thank you for your position that you've taken here. I know you have 2 hats, 2 jobs that you're performing, and I look forward to hearing your testimony. But at this moment, I'd like to turn to my ranking member here, Mr. Quigley from Illinois, for his comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I share your optimism. although I'm a Cub fan, so I'm not sure what that means. I want to also join you in welcoming the Acting Commissioner for the IRS, David Kautter, to the subcommittee. Mr. Kautter, I want to thank you for taking time and look forward to listening to your testimony. I'm going to keep my remarks brief in the interest of allowing sufficient time for our witness to share his thoughts in response to the panel's questions. This hearing comes at an important time as taxpayers nationwide prepare to submit a tax return for the 2017 tax year. The IRS is tasked with the core federal responsibility for the collection of more than $3 trillion in taxes, distributing more than $400 million in refunds, and providing service to millions of taxpayers in the process. Funding to support the IRS's mission constitutes the single largest category of spending under this subcommittee's jurisdiction, and we take seriously our responsibility to ensure that the agency is able to perform its functions in a fair and competent manner. With this in mind, I was disappointed and surprised to see the President's budget request for the IRS in fiscal year 2019 seeks a reduction in resources for the agency. This comes at a time when the National Taxpayer Advocate has sounded the alarm on irresponsible cutbacks to frontline employee training. The Inspector General for the Tax Administration is reporting that 24-hour taxpayer assistance centers, which provide a crucial in-person service for many older and rural taxpayers, are currently closed during the height of the filing season due to insufficient funds. Even more confusing is the fact that for the fiscal year during which this administration's new tax law is due for implementation, this budget proposes to reduce taxpayer services staffing at the agency by thousands of positions. After multiple years of inexcusably long wait times and unanswered phone calls, taxpayers finally saw an improvement in the level of service delivered last spring during the filing season. And yet for the coming year, when taxpayers face a brand new system of rules and systems, your budget request promises a drop from 78% level of service down to just 54%. This year, with the resources appropriated for the IRS by Congress, the IRS will make 7,661 staff available in answering the toll-free phone line. Your fiscal year 2019 request will cut the number of staff for this purpose to just 6,023 available to answer the IRS toll-free line. I sure hope that you can help us make sense of this during our discussions today, and thank you again, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Quigley. I'd like to recognize the Acting Commissioner for his testimony. I know you have a statement for the record, but feel free to make some remarks if you'd like to here, and then we'll go into some questions that we may have for you. Thank you again for joining us, Mr. Kautter.
Thank you for the opportunity to discuss the IRS budget and current operations. I want to begin by thanking Congress and especially this subcommittee for providing the IRS with an increase in funding for fiscal year 2018 in the omnibus budget bill enacted last month. This funding will allow the IRS to continue delivering on critical priorities, including improving taxpayer service, updating our information technology infrastructure, increasing cybersecurity, and safeguarding taxpayer data. I also want to express my appreciation for the additional $320 million in funding to implement the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, and especially for the flexibility we were given to shift resources between accounts. Implementing the new tax law is a critical priority for the IRS this year and next. This is the first major tax reform legislation in more than 30 years and will require extensive work by the IRS. Our goal is to ensure taxpayers and tax professionals can understand and navigate the changes made by the new law. Implementing tax reform is a huge undertaking. We estimate the IRS will need to create or revise about 450 tax forms, publications, and instructions. We will need to publish extensive guidance, including regulations, notices, frequently asked questions. And we will need to reprogram about 140 integrated tax return processing systems to be ready for the 2019 filing season. So I'm extremely grateful, excuse me, that we are receiving this additional funding in the early stages of our work on the new tax law. It ensures we can start critical implementation activities on time. And knowing the funding is available through next year allows us to let contracts appropriately and have the resources needed to test our processing systems in the first quarter of fiscal 2019, shortly before the beginning of the next tax filing season. The broad scope of our efforts required us to begin our implementation work almost immediately as soon as the law was enacted. Our initial steps to implement the new tax law included revising the withholding system to take into account the various changes by the statute. We've also begun issuing guidance, including several notices to help corporations begin complying with the new transition tax under Code Section 965. Our work to implement the new tax law has continued while we have been administering the 2018 filing season. Even with this challenge, I'm pleased to report that the filing season has gone well. As of last Friday, April 6th, the IRS has received more than 103 million individual tax returns, which is about 2/3 of the returns we expect to receive. We've issued more than 79 million refunds for more than $226 billion. About 80% of the returns filed so far claimed a refund, with the average refund totaling about $2,900. These numbers are consistent with those for 2017, with the number of returns received up from last year by about 150,000, which is about 0.1%. The number of returns filed electronically up by about 440,000, or 0.5%, and the average size of the refund up $13. The other major challenge during the filing season was the need to implement tax-related provisions in the bipartisan budget agreement enacted in February. This required us to reprogram our processing systems to handle the retroactive extension through December 31st of this year of more than 30 individual and business tax benefits that expired at the end of 2016. It was the first time the IRS had ever been required to implement retroactive tax extensions in the middle of a filing season. Looking ahead, the President's fiscal 2019 budget requests an appropriation of $11.497 billion for the IRS, which is $11.135 billion in base resources plus $362 million provided through a program integrity cap adjustment. President's budget submission seeks less costly ways of delivering taxpayer service and maintaining enforcement using technology, training, and internal efficiencies. The budget balances competing priorities and increases funding to operation support by 6.2%. Dedicated funding is needed now to modernize IRS hardware and software so that we have the technology needed to run day-to-day operations, transform the taxpayer experience, improve cybersecurity, and ensure we can continue to safeguard taxpayer data. The IRS is subject to 2.5 million cyber attacks on average each day, 1 million of which are sophisticated attacks. Some of the attacks are efforts to acquire taxpayer data, and some are efforts to disrupt the functioning of the United States government. Against this backdrop, it's important to realize that 59% of the IRS hardware and 32% of its software is obsolete. In regard to taxpayer service, we understand Congress's concerns. We're taking steps to improve service on our various channels, and we look forward to working with Congress in this area. I would note that the investments needed to improve IRS information technology that I mentioned a moment ago are critical to our efforts to improve taxpayer service. It's clear that one of the most important things we can do for taxpayers is upgrade our IT infrastructure. In addition to ensuring adequate funding for the agency, Congress can also help the IRS by enacting 3 pieces of legislation that will improve tax administration: renewing streamlined critical pay authority, allowing correction procedures for specific errors, and giving IRS authority to require minimum qualifications for tax return preparers. These provisions, along with the other items highlighted in the budget, will help the IRS continue building on its work to serve the nation's taxpayers. Chairman Graves, Ranking Member Quigley, and members of the subcommittee, that concludes my statement, and I would be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Kautter. And this morning we have a lot of subcommittees meeting today, so I think over 50% of the appropriations subcommittees are meeting, so we'll have members come in and out. And I know some of our members here even have other subcommittees they need to join this morning. So I'm going to defer my questions to a little bit later this morning, and I think Mr. Quigley's agreed to do the same. And with that, we'll start with Mr. Molinar, and then Mr. Cartwright will be next with any questions they may have for the acting commissioner. Mr. Molinar, you recognize.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Kautter. Appreciate you being here today with us. And I wanted to follow up with you on the question, some of the issues you've raised on IT modernization. You mentioned that more than 59% of the IRS's hardware is past its useful life, and 32% of the software was behind. And so I just wondered if you could comment more in depth on what your plan is to ensure that the hardware and software are updated. And can you explain why this has happened? Because that seems to be a pretty serious problem, especially in this era of cybersecurity.
Sure. Thank you. I think it's important to recognize that although 59% of the hardware and 32% of the software is out of date, the IRS has done a pretty good job, in my opinion, over the last several years of prioritizing where it spends its money. The core processing system for filing and processing tax returns has been modernized and updated. And that is where a substantial amount of the funding that this committee has appropriated to the IRS has gone. The cyber defenses around that system have operated fairly well, but cyber criminals are constantly evolving and changing their approaches. And so the IRS spends a substantial amount of money trying to ward off those cyber attacks. Where a lot of the inefficiency, where a lot of the obsolete equipment and software rests, is in the day-to-day equipment used by IRS employees. So the laptops, the printers, fax machines, and so forth. Last week, we conducted a series of 4 calls with IRS managers. And so as somebody new to the agency, right, I've been at the IRS about 5 months, it was interesting to participate in those calls. What I took away from the call, frankly, those 4 calls, we had about 3,000 employees, was a desire on the part of people at the IRS to do a good job, to perform at a high level, and to carry out their responsibilities for taxpayer service. The sense of frustration with laptops that might take 2 or 3 weeks to be repaired, with software, with help support questions that took a day or 2 to be answered, with software updates that weren't quite working the way they were supposed to in interfacing, was one of the most clear messages anybody could have received. So I think, you know, when we talk about how much is obsolete, it's easy to get concerned that the core system is in bad shape. That is not the case. That is in pretty good, solid shape, in my opinion. But a lot of surrounding operations is where the challenges are.
So if I were to summarize, you don't feel like taxpayer personal data is at risk because of these outdated systems or machines, but maybe in terms of the work environment and the frustrations of sort of day-to-day operations, that's where the problem lies.
I think that's a fair way to state it. I do worry about cybersecurity every minute of every day, to tell you the truth. And I do worry about hardware that's out of date and software. When we say obsolete, what we mean is that the software is at least 2 updates behind.
Okay.
And that worries me. But at the core system, we're really focused intently on that, and I think doing a pretty good job.
Okay. And then I wanted to just change directions a little bit and talk with you a little bit about some of the cryptocurrency or virtual currency that has become popular. And my understanding is that in 2017, 1 Bitcoin equaled over $19,000 US dollars. And the most recent IRS guidance on existing tax principles applied to transaction using virtual currency goes back to 2014. And just wondering if what your plans are, either to update that guidance. I understand that it's considered property. And do you believe that should be updated?
That is a topic that we are very intently focused on. You're exactly right. The latest guidance is 2014. We treat cryptocurrency as property, as basically a capital asset and not as a currency. There are many unanswered questions that we're dealing with respect to cryptocurrency. There's so-called forks with cryptocurrency where the currency sort of divides. And we have a task force, we have a group within the IRS focused on those questions. The biggest concern we've got, frankly, with cryptocurrency is is not just the tax treatment. It is the fact that cryptocurrency seems to be a way to evade federal income tax. And so the Criminal Investigation Division is very much focused on this. They've got some investigations underway. So it's both issues, both the technical side and then what's happening on the tax evasion and avoidance side.
Thank you very much.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Cartwright and then Mr. Yoder.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thanks for being here, Mr. Kautter. I appreciate your taking the time. And I want to talk about a couple of things. The effect of the cuts to your administration asked for in the White House budget. I understand the President's proposed funding cuts will have a particularly harsh effect as you all implement the new tax plan. Last year, roughly 25% of Americans who attempted to contact the IRS could not get through. National taxpayer advocate Nina Olson reported to Congress that up to 60% of Americans will not be able to get through during the 2018 filing season. My question first is additional funding the only barrier keeping the IRS from better serving the American people?
I would say funding is a key factor, yes, sir.
Okay. And other than requesting additional funding, what specific steps have you taken to develop or implement a plan to deal with that particular issue?
With the taxpayer service
That's right.
issue, well, what's actually interesting, I think, is that of the calls the IRS receives, only about 5% relate to the tax law itself. 95% relate to account questions, refund questions, things like that. We've tried to move as much of that online as we can and do it in a user-friendly fashion. For the taxpayer assistance centers, for example, there are 363 of those. They'll help about 5 million taxpayers this year. About half the people that call for an appointment at a taxpayer assistance center get their question answered on the phone. And so a lot of the technical assistance for taxpayers, we're trying to put out as much as we can in terms of guidance on irs.gov. And we're trying to conduct forums around the country and help tax return preparers get up to speed as well as our own people. I am, as a 40-year tax practitioner, and being on the other side of the table from the IRS, taxpayer service from the IRS is critically important. I know how important it is, and I've lived it day in and day out. The choices in the budget that have been submitted is basically a recognition, not that taxpayer assistance is not important. It is important. It's a recognition that at 2.5 million cyber attacks a day, we've got to make sure that we've got our equipment and our software up to date, and we fend off those attacks. And
Okay, and not to put too fine a point on it, the President's budget for fiscal year 19 asks for 24.5 million in cuts. You don't want that, am I correct in that?
I would say the IRS could put to good use any money that this committee, subcommittee decides to appropriate.
Okay.
We have plenty of uses.
Another place that money is well spent is on audit staff, right?
Yes, sir.
It is the backbone of our ability to catch tax cheats in America, right?
Yes, sir.
Now, there's been a steady decline in annual audits. And what we have is a new tax plan that really is rife with opportunities for tax avoidance that can set the stage for significant increases in tax evasion in this country. So my question is, first, the IRS has stated in the past that increased cuts lead to lower rates of enforcement, which results in about $5 billion in tax revenue going uncollected each year. We continuously make these cuts to taxpayer services, weaken tax enforcement, and create more opportunities for evasion. Under these circumstances, Do you believe that we can afford to sustain this system of voluntary compliance and keep reducing audit staff?
There is a point, Congressman, at which the cuts in enforcement and the reduction in enforcement will have a dramatic effect on revenue. I don't know, nor can anybody tell us exactly where that point is, but the audit rate overall is down 37% over the last 10 years. It's down in every single area that we audit but one, which is a state and gift tax, which is sort of hard to explain. But in some areas, the audit rates are down 40, 50%. And it is we've been able, I think, to manage fairly effectively. I think the agency's done a fairly good job, but it's at a point where I think we need to start focusing on additional resources. I mean,
All right, and finally, your testimony speaks for itself, of course, but instead of the $24.5 million in cuts as came out of the White House budget, what is the increase you're looking for?
well, we're looking for the additional funding for tax reform implementation. And I think we've not, at least to my knowledge, Congressman, we've not decided on a specific number that we would recommend. So at this point, I'm supporting the $11.1 billion. I think the program integrity cap of $362 million would help a lot. So I think that added to the 11.1 base budget would help us quite a bit.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, now you back.
Thank you, Mr. Cartwright. Mr. Yoder.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Commissioner, thanks for being with the committee today. Appreciate your testimony. I want to start by asking you about the minimum standards ideas for qualified preparers to provide tax services. And I know in your testimony you echoed the President's budget request proposal to require that all tax preparers meet minimum standards to prove they're qualified to prepare services. And I think you state that there are around 400,000 uncredentialed tax preparers in the country. And I guess I'd like to know, what's the impact of that? How does that impact our tax collection? How does it affect fraud? How could creating a set of minimum standards improve the efficient collection of taxes or reduction in fraudulent payments?
Sure. Thank you, Congressman Yoder, for that question. About 56% of all returns prepared are prepared by paid tax return preparers. There are about 650,000 tax return preparers in the country, 400,000 of which, as you point out, are uncredentialed, which is they're not attorneys, they're not CPAs, and they're not enrolled agents. Our experience has been that individuals who are not credentialed do not tend to file the returns at the same level of accuracy that credentialed preparers file. We're also concerned that some of those uncredentialed preparers engage in fraud and impose burdens on unsuspecting taxpayers. It's also expensive from an administrative point of view, right? The time that we have to spend chasing people who have improper returns, where the returns filed that don't match the data that we have on hand. And so our experience has been the credentialed preparers' returns tend to be of a higher caliber and require less effort on the part of the IRS to enforce the law.
And so one of the solutions that the IRS has proposed over the years is to go to this tax preparer qualification program.
Yes, sir.
Does the IRS currently have statutory authority to pursue such a program? And if yes, are you working on developing such a system? Do you need changes in law? And can you describe for the committee what that tax preparer qualification program would look like? How would the preparers' qualifications be assessed?
Sure. In 2011, we attempted to impose or issue a tax return preparer program. And it would require certain levels of education and competency. That was struck down in 2014 by the courts. In 2014, we embarked on a volunteer education program for tax return preparers, which has been very modest in its success. So we believe we would need statutory authority to issue or provide such a program for tax return preparers. So legislative authority, we believe, is necessary.
Okay. I want to turn our attention to our error and fraud rates in general and what we're doing to combat that. This is my 8th year on the committee, and with your predecessors, I think almost every year we've talked about, in particular, the earned income tax error and fraud rate. Your agency stated publicly that between 21 and 26% of all earned income tax credits or claims were paid out in error, which is a staggering number for government programs, which we know have lots of bureaucracy and waste and everything really that we try to do at a governmental level. But 21 to 26 fraud or error is it really is in its own league in how problematic that is, and that accounts for tens of billions of dollars of taxpayer dollars that were improperly paid out. According to the Treasury Inspector General, as of March 1st of this year, the IRS has already processed 9.4 million returns with 46.9 billion in EITC refunds. Under the PATH Act passed by Congress in 2015, the IRS is required to hold back EITC refunds for returns that trigger additional review. Can you tell the committee what percentage of total returns claiming the EITC have been flagged for review, what indicators are most common for triggering review, and have we made any progress in reducing the fraud and error rate in this program?
Congressman, I don't have the statistics for this year yet. We have implemented a series of additional filters and screens to try to identify fraud in the EITC program. We are focused on it. I think the PATH Act provisions requiring us to hold those returns until February 15th has been very helpful. I think we'll find that that has substantially reduced the amount of improper payments. But I just don't have, we're in the midst of filing season. We've got 6 days to go. And so I can get those numbers for you as soon as we have.
Well, I know you're quite busy right now, but I'd love to see those numbers
Yes, sir.
because we want to see if we're making progress. So if you'd follow up with the committee and my office, I would
It's
appreciate it.
a serious problem. Yes,
Thank
sir.
you, Mr. Commissioner.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Yoder. Mr. Quigley, you're
Thank you,
recognized.
Mr. Chairman. Thank you again, Mr. Kautter. The National Taxpayer Advocate's 2017 annual report to Congress highlighted the implementation of the IRS's private debt collection program as one of its most serious problems and concerns. The report found that not only is the program failing to generate revenue, but is also the implementation is inconsistent with the law and disproportionately focuses on low-income and average working taxpayers. Can you give us your take on that report and what specific actions the department will take in response to the report's findings and recommended actions to improve the IRS's private debt collections programs, oversight, administration?
Sure. So a couple of, a little bit of background, and we're in the process of responding to the Taxpayer Advocates report. Last April, we entered into contracts with 4 private debt collection agencies. Since that time, we have turned over about 305,000 accounts for collection. It's about a little over $2 billion of outstanding debt that individuals owe. We've spent about $45 million so far on getting the program up and running, and we've collected about $35 million under the program. Now, the $45 million represents the total cost of getting the program up and running. Part of that cost was we wanted to be meticulous in making sure the taxpayer data was appropriately secure and that the systems that the various debt collection agencies were using were secure. We have also conducted on-site visits with each of those debt collection agencies and have found that, for the most part, they are acting in accordance with IRS regulations and standards. We will go back again shortly and do another review of those debt collection agencies. I understand that this is a very sensitive issue. A large number of those accounts that are turned over are accounts that are below, say, 250% or 400% of the poverty level. So it is a lot of low-income accounts that are turned over. It turns out that when you look at the data for where the outstanding debt is, a substantial amount of the outstanding debt is in that taxpayer group.
When you turn these accounts over, is it sort of a sensitivity or awareness of who you're targeting?
It is,
I mean, is there also a balance that you may be going after people who just don't have the money?
I think at times, every account that is turned over is an account where a taxpayer, we believe, owes the federal government money. If it turns out that the money can't be collected, we engage in our normal processes, and if we can't collect it, it can't be collected. But we try to pursue what's available under the law and what is expected of us in terms of pursuing amounts that are owed the federal government.
How do you compare the effectiveness of what they're doing versus, if you can, apples to apples with how you normally go after from a debt collection point of view?
It's a very similar process, Congressman. I mean, the only accounts that are turned over are accounts that the IRS has pursued to the full extent of its resources and has concluded that we just don't have the capability, the resources to pursue the account any further. And so those are the accounts that tend to be turned over to the private debt collection agencies.
I mean, they're harder to collect?
They are harder to collect, yes, sir. We've tried everything we can before we turn over an account. So it's not that we just select a group of accounts and turn those over. We go through our full array of processes in dealing with taxpayers before the account is turned over to a private debt collection agency.
I think clearly there's more time. If there's more time, we go into more debt concerns on these things. But, you know, we used to have concerns about people posing as debt collectors. Hasn't this muddied those waters where we used to tell them that there aren't private people doing this, and now there are? So it's harder to advise people who are particularly vulnerable, like senior citizens, of how to distinguish this.
It is. I mean, we've tried to put in place processes so that it's clear who is acting on behalf of the IRS and who is not. Having said that, we have problems across the board with individuals trying to impersonate the IRS and basically defraud people out of their own money. And those techniques continue to evolve. I mean, this year there's a technique where somebody will call you on the phone, usually the elderly, claim they're from the IRS, claim that an excess refund went into their account and that they owe the IRS money. And if they don't pay the IRS the money almost immediately, that they'll levy on the account. And it's not an IRS person. We don't do business that way. So it's a constantly evolving challenge to keep track of the ways individuals will try to defraud people out of money and using the IRS as its imprimatur.
Thank you, Mr. Quigley. Mr. Young from Iowa, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to pick up on the conversation you were just having with my colleague, Mr. Quigley, regarding those scams that are out there. It's April. People are thinking about doing their taxes, and many times with their interactions with the IRS, they realize something's not quite right, and maybe their identity has been stolen or there's been some real issue. Aside from what you just highlighted with Mr. Quigley, what are some of the other kind of IRS-type scams that are out there that the American people need to know about it, one? And two, how are you informing the American people about these and how to be watchful for them?
Well, Congressman, whenever we become aware of a scam, we immediately issue press releases. We try to get on radio. We try to communicate with taxpayers in whatever way that's available to us. Sometimes the fraudsters are so convincing and so compelling that no matter what we say, people are intimidated into believing the IRS is after them and they're defrauded from their money. So the scams are important for us to focus on. And as I said, it'd be nice to be more proactive, but we end up being reactive because we don't know where the crooks are going until they actually engage in that sort of behavior and we hear about it. I think the one area where we have made a lot of progress is with respect to taxpayer identity theft. And we've worked closely with the tax return preparer industry and with state revenue departments. And with respect to tax-related identity theft, the reported cases have gone down from about 697,000 2 years ago to 242,000 at the moment. We've set up a separate unit within the Wage and Investment Division of the IRS to help people who are the victims of identity theft. We resolve those cases now. 75% of those cases get resolved within 3 months, maybe 3 to 4 months, which is about half of the time it used to take. So when we become aware of something that's systemic, we put in place processes and procedures to deal with it, and I think we've had pretty good success. But it's the continuous evolving nature of these scams that's the biggest challenge.
There's a lot of them out there, a lot of bad people out there who want to bilk people of their money. I would advocate that you highlight somewhere, whether it's on your maybe it's just on your website, or have a social media account, Twitter account. You talk about issuing a press release about the scams out there. I know you probably go beyond that,
Yes,
but
we do. Yeah.
highlight those right away on social media, what to look out for, those kind of things. And you say that 75% of those cases of ID theft get resolved. When you find the perpetrator, how many of those get sent over to the Department of Justice for prosecution? Tell me about that.
We do. So there's the two aspects, the victim and the perpetrator. And the victim is where we've set up that separate unit. And we get those cases resolved. We said 3 to 4 months, probably closer to 4 as I think about it. We also get the Criminal Investigation Division of the IRS involved in these particular situations. They work very closely with the Department of Justice on referrals with respect to prosecution. We try to highlight those prosecutions as a deterrent for others who would think that they may engage in this sort of behavior. And my personal experience is the Criminal Investigation Division at the IRS is a very effective division. They do a very good job. They're very thorough. They're very quick. And I've got great confidence in the job they do.
So what are the penalties? Are the people who are taking others' identity, are they just getting a fine? I want to see them in jail.
It is. It depends on the nature of what they do, but it could be tax fraud, which could be criminal, could be a felony. And we try to prosecute to the full extent available under the law.
Do you find that the DOJ is cooperating with you all and making sure that this is a priority?
They are. We have very strong working relationship with the Department of Justice, and they're very responsive to our needs.
Thank you for your testimony and for being here today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Young. I have a couple questions, and then if members have some additional questions afterwards, we'll continue. I wanted to ask you a little bit about the Income Verification Express service. That was something that in the recent funding bill, we had some report language directing the IRS to write a report on the potential automation of the IVES program, which is known as Data Sharing API. Now, today, I understand the process still involves some paper and fax machines to do some of this work. And this is really some important information that lenders need and to provide more capital to the small businesses and such. So can you give us a little update on how a change like this can occur and hopefully will occur, and what the process is for that?
Sure. We've been, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for that question. We have been working with the mortgage industry to make sure that the IVE system works in a way that facilitates their needs. We've gone to third factor identification, so username, password, and then a text. When we first implemented that created some problems for the mortgage industry. We worked through that. We've set up a working group that is meeting periodically with the financial services industry to make sure that they can get access to the information that they need while balancing the risks to taxpayer privacy as part of that system. There is no right answer to this system. Different people would do it different ways. The Inspector General would do it differently than the way we're currently conducting it. I will tell you I've had some discussions with representatives of the mortgage industry, and they are in fact looking at another alternative to accessing the IRS databases, and we're fully supportive of helping them or facilitating whatever needs to be done to make sure that system works effectively. And I think it's been working pretty good. We've gotten favorable comments back recently.
That's good. Well, how long, is this a process that will take some time still? It sounds like you've begun the process, you're still working with the industry, but you're open to modifications as time goes on.
That is exactly right. And they are continuing, as I said, the industry has been looking into another database at another agency which they think may serve their purposes. And if that works better for them, we will do everything we can to facilitate that. We want the system to work. It's that balance between giving third parties access to taxpayer information and making sure that we don't improperly disclose taxpayer information.
Right. Great. Well, thank you. We spoke a little bit earlier about the new tax reform law that's been implemented. And this is going to be a huge challenge, I know, for the IRS and its implementation. And you have some additional resources to work with when we passed, and the President signed $320 million additional dollars for that implementation. Can you describe the progress that's being made to update, and I know a lot of this is going to be IT related, a lot of your systems to accommodate this new law, because it's going to be tremendous. And then, as we move forward, I know that as taxpayers look, and we said the next 6 days as the filing season comes to a close, this will be the last time that the old tax law is being used to comply with and going into a new one. And so I know you're taking a lot of steps. You have additional resources, but my hope, and maybe you could reassure this committee that next year it will be easier from a filing perspective, but also implementation from the IRS's interface with the customer.
Sure. So first of all, for the third time, thank you again for the $320 million. It is a great benefit, and especially the flexibility. The way we plan to spend that money, 73% of the funds are earmarked, we believe will be used for technology. So updating those 140 integrated systems that operate the taxpayer filing programs. About 19% of the funds will be, it's about 19% of the funds will go for taxpayer education and outreach. We expect probably an additional 4 million calls as a result of the tax bill. So a significant part of the funding will go for outreach, education, and seminars for tax return preparers. 4% of the funds will go for forms, instructions, and publications. And another 4% of the funds will go for guidance, regulations, frequently asked questions, and other press releases and other guidance. We expect we're going to have to update about 450 forms. It could be less than that, but forms, publications, and instructions. Where things stand, we expect by the end of this month to have most, if not all, of the forms for next year drafted. We expect to have the instructions for those forms pretty much done by the end of May. Plan is to release over the summer those forms and instructions for public comment and review. We will be working on the publications over the summer as well, and may release some of those, but we don't often release those for comment. Starting at the end of April, once we have the forms designed, the core forms, the technology piece will start. So we will start in May to revise our programs to incorporate the revised forms and instructions. Guidance we are working on continuously. There are 79 grants of regulatory authority in the bill, not to mention the other broader grants that we have. We've issued a number of notices. We're working on regulations constantly. We hope to have a steady stream of guidance in the form of frequently asked questions, notices, proposed regulations, and final regulations coming out this spring. We've already issued some, but the spring, the summer, and the fall. It will take us a couple of years at least to get guidance out on the entire bill. I think the two most challenging parts of the bill from an administrative point of view to implement will be the new international provisions and the 20% deduction for pass-through entities. In both those situations, we are basically building new tax regimes that didn't exist before. So we've gone from a worldwide system of taxing our multinationals to a pretty much territorial system, and that is a completely new system for the United States. It comes with base erosion provisions, which are controversial. Some of our international trading partners have some concerns with some of those provisions. So that is an enormous part of the challenge. The pass-through provision, I think, is going to be challenging to draft. I think we can do it, but I think we'll spend inordinate amounts of time on those two parts of the law implementing that.
We have great confidence in you. That's an ambitious schedule, and thanks for laying that out. That helps us. And I know 6 months ago or so, when you stepped into your role here, you probably did not anticipate the challenges that lie ahead. Thank you for the progress and laying out the plan there. Mr. Quigley, you have any comments?
Excuse me. Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I just want to follow up on that. The original estimate from the IRS was about $495 million for the cost of implementation. Was that over a period of years, or just you settled for 320 because that's what you could get?
That's a great question. Thank you. So the $495 million was an estimate that was sort of a back-of-the-envelope estimate that we came up with looking at implementation of the Tax Reform Act in 1986. Now, in 1986, there was no internet, there were no PCs, and a large part of the cost of implementing the 86 Act was printing forms. Well, that's a much smaller cost today. So what we did was, after doing that back-of-the-envelope calculation, went back and did a grassroots build of all the forms we thought we had to change, all the instructions, all the publications, and tried to refine the number as best we could. And what we found was the cost of printing and distributing forms had gone down substantially. The internet and the ability to communicate technologically dramatically helped our ability to reduce the cost in implementing this bill. And so it's really, the 397 is a number that's been developed from the operating divisions up, and it's fairly detailed. Is it perfect? I doubt it, but we did the best we could, and I think we'll be in pretty good shape with that amount of money.
But it runs into next year's request.
Oh, yes,
which
sir.
which is a downward departure, and I'm just curious, how do those two flush together to allow you to move forward? Let's say this is enough, and you're absolutely right, to do what you need to do and probably can do in 2018. But the 5% of the calls that you say that come about the tax law now is going to be a lot. The decimal point may move over next year. So how does the fact that you may have enough this year run into next year's request?
Sure. So we put the budget together before we knew what the number was going to be for tax reform implementation. And so that is why for this year and next year, we requested a separate amount of $397 million for tax reform implementation, in addition to the $11.1 billion base request. So we've got 320 that we can use this year and next year. Our original request was for 397. Our belief is we still need that additional $77 million. But the flexibility to use that money over 2 years is really very helpful.
And have you talked to the administration about what you just said in terms of what your needs are going to be?
Yes, well, yes, sir.
And their reaction?
Well, the $397 million number that we've proposed was developed with full discussion with the Secretary of the Treasury. And so he is, in fact, I meet with the Secretary every day on tax reform implementation. And so he is fully supportive of the $397 million number.
So this time next year, this is going to be a happy, happy, joy, joy discussion. Things will have folded under. You're going to have had enough money, right?
I think if we get the 397, I think we can do the job. I think we can do it.
Thanks.
Yes, sir.
And I can say that I've had multiple conversations with the Secretary of Treasury about that very same number, and he has full confidence as well. And you have an additional role, I know, that you work very closely as Assistant Secretary of the Treasury of Tax Policy.
Yes, sir.
If I'm correct. Mr. Amadeus joined us and has a question for you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Commissioner, welcome. And you may not know this, but if you don't, that's fine. I can take the answer offline. But, you know, we hear a lot of talk these days about agencies responding to or not responding to requests from various committees, at least in this House, regarding data information and stuff they're looking at. As we sit here, are you aware of any outstanding data requests from any committees in the House that haven't been fulfilled? And if you're not, that's fine, but I would just like to ask you on the record to kind of check on that.
Sure.
And give us give us an answer to say, hey, as far as, I know some of that stuff started quite a while ago, previous administration, but as we're finding out, it's like there's a lot of stuff that was previous administration that's still hanging fire. So I'm just curious as to, is there anything outstanding where information is forthcoming or whatever?
I will follow.
Thank you,
follow up
appreciate
on
that. Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
At one point, Mr. Amedeo, I will say, at one point in my career, I was a Senate staff person for a member of the Senate Finance Committee, and my sensitivity to responding to members of Congress and their requests is paramount in my mind.
And I appreciate that. I mean, and it's not the reason I get up in the morning, but when you hear that it's an extended amount of time and whatever, you're like, I mean, in your business and mine, you don't always like the news, but you think you got a right to know what the information is, so I appreciate that.
It's a fair point.
Thank you.
Sir.
Easiest question of the day, right there. So, I have additional quick question, and then Mr. Young, if you have a question after that, you'll be recognized. Earlier, I guess it was earlier this year and just last month, the Ways and Means Committee, one of their subcommittees, released a draft proposal called the Taxpayer First Act. And I just want to get your thoughts on that, and if maybe you could share how does that fit into your plan and the IRS's plan moving forward, and any feedback you may have as they work through that.
Sure. We've had discussions with the Ways and Means Committee staff as they put that bill together. And for the most part, we're supportive of the provisions of that bill. I mean, we'd have to go through them one by one, but for the most part, we think it's pretty constructive. I do think there's one provision that seems small, but is very important to me as someone who has come into the government from private practice. And it is the ability to allow the IRS to change its structure after consulting with Congress. The current structure of the Internal Revenue Service was put in place in 1998, so it's 20 years. There aren't many organizations in the country who have had the same operating structure for the last 20 years. And I think there are things that can be done to facilitate taxpayer service. And the core, right, so organizational management, the basic theme is that structure follows strategy. If the strategy is taxpayer assistance, and we're not happy with the level of taxpayer assistance at the moment, then I think we have to figure out what needs to be done to improve that and implement a structure that supports that strategy. And other than that, I mean, the provisions are fairly straightforward, pretty functional, and I think for the most part pretty sound.
Great, thank you. And I'd encourage you and your staff to continue working with the committee. That's encouraging to know that y'all have that relationship and give them your thoughts there as well. Mr. Young, you have any questions?
Thank you. Just one question. My understanding is when sometimes there's a dispute between the IRS and a taxpayer, the IRS will reach out to the taxpayer and say there's an issue here. Sometimes the taxpayer will reach out to the IRS and think there may be an issue there with their return or something dealing with the IRS. And there's an appeals process, and they go through that. And for the taxpayer to get the information they need to have everything they need for the appeal to present their case, they've got to go through a FOIA request to the IRS to kind of get the information the IRS has that they may be using as a information or a tool against them. Do you think that's ridiculous? Because I do, and a lot of people do.
One of the areas that the Ways and Means Committee is working on as part of its restructuring bill is exactly that.
That's the FAST Act.
How the appeals process works. And I do think there are changes that could be made there that would facilitate taxpayer knowledge and assistance and simplify the process, frankly, for both the IRS and the taxpayers.
So we have your full endorsement of the legislation that'll
I
be
did
coming
not
through.
know that I said that exactly.
You didn't. But it's good to hear that just internally, you recognize there's ways to improve this for the experience for the taxpayer, transparency, accountability, cooperation. It's needed. Thank you for recognizing that. And
I agree, and that's why I think the IRS Restructuring Act can be a catalyst for generating change within the agency. So I think it's a good path to go down, frankly.
thank you for recognizing that there are common sense approaches that we can all agree on. Thank you.
Mr. Kautter, thank you for your thoughtful responses to a very thoughtful committee. They have a lot of great questions and insights here, and I hope you see that we look forward to working with you. We want to make sure that you are successful, your agency is successful, because that means our constituents' needs are being met, and that they're pleased with their interaction, interface with the IRS. Which is not always the most pleasant interaction to ever have. So thank you for your willingness to step in as an acting commissioner at this time in your career. And I know you have other responsibilities. It's a busy time of year for you as it is for us. But thanks for your time today and joining us.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Meeting
Mr.
adjourned.
Quigley, members, thank you.